Chapter 31. As the afternoon lengthened into evening and then into night, Horace became increasingly restless and bored. He shifted position continually and sighed repeatedly. Will steadfastly ignored him. This annoyed Horace, who knew his friend was intentionally taking no notice of him. Eventually, after a particularly extended sigh, followed by a prolonged shifting of position and shuffling of shoulders and buttocks, Will could no longer pretend not to notice. "It's a pity you didn't bring a trumpet," he said. "That way you could make a bit more noise." Horace, pleased that he had finally provoked the beginning of a conversation, answered immediately. "What I don't get," he said, "is why we didn't run this cart out here now, instead of doing it hours ago. We could have waited comfortably in the trees until nightfall, then run out, lost the wheel, and had only an hour or so to wait for Malcolm's monsters. It would have been much less boring than crouching here all afternoon and into the night." "It's supposed to be boring," Will snapped. "That's the idea." "You want to be bored?" Horace asked. "No." Will spoke very patiently. He adopted the tone an adult might use talking to a very young child. It had been some time since he'd done that with Horace, and the warrior found that he didn't like it any more now than he had previously. "I wanted the sentries to be bored. I wanted them so used to the sight of this cart that it became part of the scenery. I wanted them to look at it for hours and hours with absolutely nothing happening, so that they would eventually believe that nothing is going to happen. If we'd only come out of the trees now, they'd still be suspicious when the time comes, and they'd possibly still have their eyes on us. This way, they've seen the cart clearly, in full daylight, and they think they have nothing to fear from it. They're bored with it, in fact." "Well, maybe," Horace said reluctantly. Actually, what Will said made sense. But still, he was bored, and cold too. They were sitting on a mixture of melted snow and saturated grass, and the earth itself still held the bold, chilling numb of winter. As he had the thought, Horace felt an overwhelming sense to sneeze. He tried to smother the sound, but only succeeded in making it louder. Will looked up angrily, shaking his head in disbelief. "Will you shut up?" he said tautly. Horace shrugged in apology. "I'm sorry," he said. "I sneezed. A person can't help it when they sneeze." "Perhaps not, but could you try to make it sound a little less like an elephant trumpeting in agony?" Will told him. Horace wasn't prepared to take that lying down. Crouching down, perhaps, but lying down, never. "And, of course, you'd know what an elephant sounds like. Have you ever heard an elephant?" he challenged. But Will was unabashed by his logic. "No," he said, "but I'm sure they couldn't be any louder than that sneeze." Horace sniffed disdainfully, then wished he hadn't. Sniffing only created the urge to sneeze again, and he fought against it valiantly, finally quelling it. He sensed Will was right. The sneeze had been particularly loud. On the ramparts, the corporal in command looked at one of the soldiers standing by him. "Did you hear that?" he asked. From the soldier's reaction and the way he was staring into the darkness, it was obvious that he had. "It sounded like an animal," he said uncertainly. "In pain." "Big animal," the corporal agreed uneasily. They peered into the night together. Fortunately, neither of them connected the strange sound with the ruined cart. Will had proven to be right. The sentries barely noticed the dark shape any more. "God knows what goes on in that forest," the corporal said eventually. "Whatever it was, it seems to have gone now," said the other man. They hoped he was right. 20 meters away, under the cart, Horace had his cloak doubled over his head, and his fist rammed up tight under the soft cartilage between his nostrils to prevent another sneeze. The following day he would find a bruise and wonder how it got there. When the urge finally subsided, he sagged against the cart, his eyes streaming. Will, who had seen the immense effort he had gone to, patted his shoulder. "Good work," he said sympathetically. Horace nodded, too exhausted for further comment. The moon rose, passed over them, flooding the land around them with pale light, then sank below the tops of the trees in the west. Will felt his heart rate begin to accelerate. The time of waiting was nearly over. He looked at Horace and realized his friend knew it too. He was no longer shifting and twitching. Instead, he was slowly and carefully stretching his cramped arm and leg muscles, easing out the kinks caused by long hours of inactivity. Carefully, the tall warrior unfastened his round buckler from where it was tied to the side of the cart. Will watched as he removed the thick white canvas covering the front of his shield to reveal the glossy white enamel surface with its gleaming green oak leaf symbol in the center. "Good to see you'll be fighting under your true colors," he smiled. Horace smiled briefly in return. He was becoming focused now. Will could see that this was a different person from the fidgeting, complaining Horace who had sheltered under the cart for the past 8 hours. This was a very deadly, very serious Horace, a master of his craft, and Will was glad he was here. Once they hit the top of the ramparts, he knew it would be Horace who would bear the brunt of the fighting until the Scandians could make their way up the ladder to join them. He couldn't think of anyone he would rather have by his side. He realized that he had preparations of his own to make. He checked that his quiver, with its 24 gray-shafted arrows, were firmly in position. His longbow was tied to the underside of the cart, and he untied it now. It was unstrung, of course. There was no point in leaving it under tension for the hours they had spent waiting. He checked that the string was in position, without any tangles or loops. The bow had a draw weight of 85 pounds, and it would be virtually impossible to string it in the cramped position under the cart. He'd do it as soon as they moved out from under the shelter of the sloped roof. He checked the big sax knife at his belt and touched his hand to the throwing knife in the hidden sheath behind the back of his collar. The sheath's position was a little awkward, and he remembered how he had been unable to reach it quickly during the fight with Macindaw. He made a mental note to tell Holt and Crowley that the collar sheath was a bad idea. In the distance, from beyond the far side of the castle, they heard the drawn-out moan of a ram's horn. One long note that went on, finally fading away. "Start counting," Will told Horace. The arrangement with Malcolm was that the huge image of the night warrior would be projected 20 seconds after the horn stopped. As Horace counted, Will slipped out from under the cart, staying behind it so that he was still shielded from the ramparts as he set the string on his longbow. He felt Horace begin to stir under the court. "Come on out," he said, "but stay down." Horace crawled into the open, half straightening behind the cover of the cart. They both peered into the dark sky above the castle. They wouldn't see the projection from here, but they might see the reflection of the light in the low clouds, Will thought. "There it is," whispered Horace. There was a brief flash of light in the sky, and they saw the next demonstration as a ball of fire rose into the night, hissing and trailing a banner of sparks behind it before exploding high above the ground in a shower of red embers. Then the flash repeated itself, just for a few brief seconds. It was important, Malcolm had told them, not to leave a projection in place for more than a second or two. Any longer and the eye could focus clearly on it and realize that it was a crude outline that didn't move. Flashing it on and off like this, with other lights to distract the watcher's eyes, created a sensation of movement and uncertainty. "Let them think what they want to see, rather than what they really see," Malcolm had said. They could hear voices shouting on the ramparts now as men reacted to the terrifying images shimmering in the fog. "Let's go," Will said. He drew his sax and slashed the bindings that held the ladder on top of the cart's roof. Horace threw it easily over his shoulder. His shield slung over his back, and together they ran for the castle wall. Karen was on the main hall of the keep when he heard the shouting and the bang of the first rocket exploding. He was already armed and wearing chainmail, and he dashed into the courtyard, climbing the stairs to the south ramparts 2 and 3 at a time. The shouting was coming from that side, and he realized he had been right. This was where the attack was coming. He reached the ramparts and found the sentries gathered in a small knot, staring fearfully into the darkness. Their voices formed an incomprehensible babble as they all talked at once. "Silence!" he yelled, and as they obeyed, he singled out the sergeant in charge. "Sergeant, what's going—" He got no further. Suddenly, in the dark night sky, some 200 meters from the castle's south wall, a gigantic shadow figure loomed against the mist, huge, evil, terrifying, and gone. almost as soon as it appeared. Karen actually staggered back at the sight of it. But then a demonic red face began to rise from the ground, soaring into the air and exploding into darkness. And even as it did, another massive shape loomed in the mist, a black shadowed outline of a dragon that seemed to quiver and shake and then disappear. A strange, hollow voice could be heard, laughing hysterically. The sound chilled Karen. The men around him shouted in fear. Several dropped to their knees, doubled over as if to hide from the horrible sights before them. He kicked savagely at the nearest man. "Get up, you yellow-skinned coward!" he cursed. But his voice was hoarse and his throat was dry. He could feel the skin on his arms prickling and dimpling, and the hairs on the back of his neck rising in fear. Then, 50 meters from where they had first seen it, the giant warrior flickered on and off again. A series of colored lights flashed across the ground at the height of a man's head, and the laughter was back, more bone-chilling than before. Buttle appeared beside Karen, his face haggard with fear. He pointed wordlessly into the night as the dragon reappeared, then a huge lion, then a warrior again, all interspersed with images of that demonic face soaring into the air and disappearing. "It's sorcery," he cried. "You said there was no sorcerer. Look at this, you fool." "Get a hold of yourself." Karen snarled at him. "It's a trick. It's nothing but a trick." "A trick?" Buttle answered. "I know sorcery when I see it." Karen grabbed the man and shook him. "Get a hold of yourself," he said savagely. "Can't you see? This is what Barton wants. They'll be coming at us any minute, so get the men to the ramparts." He gestured at the cowering sentries grouped together in fear and backing as far away from the wall as they could. More and more men had run from the east and west walls to view the terrifying scene outside the castle. As Buttle hesitated, half accepting that Karen might be right, they heard a voice shouting, "Here they come!"